I de her måneder for 30 år siden faldt Sovjetunionen fra hinanden. Efter at have formet en stor del af Europas og verdens historie gennem næsten 70 år, brød det kommunistiske diktatur sammen i efteråret 1991.
Дорогие соотечественники, сограждане, в силу сложившейся ситуации с образованием Содружества независимых государств я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР. Совершен прорыв на пути демократических преобразований. Реальными стали свободные выборы, свобода печати, религиозные свободы, представительные органы власти, многопартийность, права человека признаны как высший принцип.
Det sovjetiske regime gik i opløsning og forsvandt, men arven efter det findes endnu og kan stadig lade sig registrere, ikke kun i Rusland og Øst- og Centraleuropa, men også her i Vesten. Forleden havde jeg besøgt den amerikanske forfatter og historiker Anne Applebaum. Hun har skrevet flere bøger om Sovjetunionen, om Rusland og om de udviklinger, Øst- og Centraleuropa gennemgår lige nu. Senest demokratiets tusmørke, der kom sidste år. Jeg spurgte hende først, hvorfor strømmen af idéer og idealer om demokrati, retsstatsprincipper og markedsøkonomi, som for præcis 30 år siden flød fra vest mod øst, nu synes at være blevet afløst af en strøm den anden vej. Hvorfor forestillingen om det autoritære regime som det ideelle nu er blevet en russisk eksportsucces?
It's happened, first of all, because we have stopped sending out a flow of ideas ourselves. It's happened because the Russians, along with the Chinese, the Cubans, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, and many others, have learned how to use contemporary social media and modern information technology to send their messages out better. They are trying much harder to compete than they did 20 or 30 years ago. They have, complicated influence campaigns that they use inside our countries. And we don't yet really have a response.
Let's talk about the Russian heirs to the Soviet Union. Why has the import of, or why did the import of ideas of democracy and so on, why was that never realized in Russia? Why didn't that become a form of basis of political and economic life in Russia?
Well, what happened in Russia, remember that in the 1990s, those ideas were very exciting to a lot of Russians, and they really inspired people. If you go back and read Russian newspapers and Russian publications from the time, you see that people are talking about a moral transformation of the country. How can we change the way we do things? How can we begin to behave differently? But what you had in Russia, essentially, was a kind of revanchist reverse coup. And you had a group of disgruntled former KGB officers who didn't like the collapse of the Soviet Union slowly come back and take over the country. I mean, the people who are now running Russia are people who were educated inside the old Russian security system and who see the world very much through that lens. So they see foreigners as, by definition, threatening. They are, anybody who is in opposition to them is therefore in opposition to the state, is therefore a traitor. There's no such thing as divided opinions. There's no basis for for any kind of legitimate debate inside the country. So the leaders of Russia are. It's not the same system that it was before, but they are people with very similar mentality.
Was it ever realistic that Russia would become part of a democratic European community?
I think there are some people in Russia who still believe that, who are working towards it, and who continue to imagine it. And if they can imagine it, then I think we should be open enough to imagining it. We should continue to hold open that possibility, and we should continue to think that way.
Now let's talk about some of the countries in Eastern and Central Europe. To which extent has Vladimir Putin's Russia been able to re-establish Soviet influence or perhaps even dominance in the countries that used to lie behind the Iron Curtain?
It's not really Soviet-style influence. It's now more what the Russians seek to do is create corrupt business links, links of corruption and political influence. They run disinformation campaigns. And I should say they run them not only in countries close to their borders, they run them all over the world. They ran a very successful one in the United States in 2016. They ran a disinformation campaign as part of the U.S. election. They've intervened in German and French and Spanish politics as well. So this isn't something that's confined to their region. There are several vectors of influence. As I said, they do these famous social media campaigns where they impersonate different groups on Facebook, but they also use their companies, which are they're kind of quasi-state companies owned by private people who also work in the Kremlin. They also use them as part of their foreign policy, and they use the famous. The spies who try to poison people and create chaos in different places too.
Each country that used to be part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, of course, have each their history and each have taken their path. But what, in your mind, are the most profound marks in those countries left by the Soviet Union that was dissolved 30 years ago?
It's interesting. I actually think that there's less difference now between West and East than almost there ever has been, because really the most profound mark that we're not really talking about just Soviet occupation, but communist political systems that they left on the countries where they were in charge was this creation of distrust. People didn't trust the state. They thought of the state as something foreign. It was. Even in Polish, there's an expression "oni," which means them. Them. The state was somebody else, not me. And that feeling, of course, is very destructive of democracy. Because if the state is something else, then my participation doesn't really make any difference. It doesn't matter. But actually, that kind of distrust, that distrust of the state and of state institutions, you can now find in quite a number of Western democracies as well.
And then what is the strength, or as it's called in your most recent book, Twilight of Democracy, in the subtitle, the seductive lure of authoritarianism? What is that attraction? What is the attraction about the authoritative?
So it's something that shouldn't be so mysterious to us. I mean, all of our democracies, in fact, are, if you look at the long range of human history, are relatively new. The idea that there should be one person in charge, that there should be no divisions inside the state, that society should be homogenous. This is a very old idea, and it's been appealing for many centuries. I mean, we used to have monarchies. I mean, you still have one, stipulate it's not quite the same as it once was, but we used to have absolute monarchies. There is a part of the population, and there's maybe even a part of every human brain that wishes for silence, control, stability, and that fears the sometimes raucous, sometimes disorganizing nature of democratic debate.
You even have in your book, you're citing an economist who has worked on figures saying that something like a third of a population is somehow
yes.
open to the idea of the
yes. This is
authoritarianism.
This is Karen Stenner, who has done a lot of studying of the what she calls authoritarian predisposition in people, and she reckons about a third of any country is bothered by change, they're bothered by argument, they're bothered by the kind of raucous noise of aggressive conversation.
Is this what has brought somebody like Viktor Orban to power?
It's partly that. I mean, Orban is also partly in power because of he's been very good at creating creating for Hungarians the idea that they need to be afraid, that the outside world, that Muslims, that foreigners are challenging their way of life, and that he is the one who stands between them and that terrible danger. And he spent a lot of effort and time creating that sense of danger. And of course, as Karen Stenner would note, it's very often these moments when people feel challenged and they feel endangered that they want some kind of authoritarian figure to take charge and stabilize the situation.
I remember covering NATO-Russian relations as a rookie security affairs correspondent in Brussels some 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And at that time, colleagues and officials were reassuring me that Russia you don't need to worry about any longer. Russia has the economy the size of Holland, and how can a country with the economy the size of Holland in any way in any foreseeable future threaten us in the West anymore? That has changed, hasn't it?
This is often, usually this is said in the context of China. You know, with our real problem is China, Russia is this small thing that will go away. I mean, the trouble is that even if you're a small economy, even if you're a declining economy, if your most important foreign policy goal is to destroy Western democracy, and all of your cleverest people have been sent to think about this problem and to find multiple ways to do it, to undermine democracies, break up the European Union, and get the Americans to leave Europe, then even if you never achieve all of those things, I mean, just like the Soviet Union never achieved international world revolution, even if you never achieve them, you can do a lot of damage along the way.
Did we underestimate the heirs to the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire?
I think we underestimated their cynicism, and we underestimated the degree to which they now believe that they can only stay in power if they can undermine the idea of democracy. I mean, what is Putin most afraid of? He's most afraid of a democratic revolution in his own country, of the kind that he saw when he was a very young officer in Dresden in 1989. Of the kind that his mentor Andropov saw in Budapest in 1956, of the kind he saw in Ukraine in 2014. And so, and whether or not you think that's a realistic possibility in Russia, it's what he's afraid of. And so all of his effort and energy is focused on making sure that Russians don't admire Western democracies, and also on undermining them to make sure that they don't seem attractive to his own people.
Just after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, people used to say the Cold War's over, the Soviet Union lost, and the West won. Is that still a fair way of understanding what happened?
I mean, the Cold War is certainly over, and it's really important that we begin to see the world in different ways, because the kinds of tactics that authoritarians use now are very different from those then. And I often have the feeling that our diplomatic toolbox is still stuck somewhere in 1987 or maybe 1992. So it's important to remember that it's over. But the idea that there would be some kind of moment of triumph, this idea that there was, that from now on liberal democracy is inevitable, turned out to be actually a very dangerous one. Because if liberal democracy is inevitable, and we don't have to do very much in order for it to sort of keep winning, then, well, none of us really have to do anything. We can let the professional politicians go on and run things, and the rest of us can get on with whatever, making money or painting paintings. And we don't have to think about it or be engaged in our politics, let alone worry about foreign countries. And I think this idea of inevitability was dangerous, and it's one of the getting over it. In fact, moving on to a new understanding of the world, namely that the world keeps evolving, that the relationship between democracy and autocracy continues to change, and that we need to be engaged in that all the time is very important.
That was precisely my last question. Should we see authoritarianism as we see it developing in Poland, where you live yourself with your family, in neighboring, in Hungary, right now, most obvious? Is the authoritarianism of the day, is that a passing phenomenon? Or do you think that it's rather, and historically, a natural state of affairs? The desire of some people to remain in power and never lose power, which is essentially what we're talking about in these would-be one-party states, is always going to be with us. That some people will come into, obtain political power, use it to raise money for themselves and their family, and then seek to never lose it. I'm afraid this is a human flaw that we will see repeated again and again. And, thinking about it, being aware of it, and making sure that we don't allow any of, ourselves to slip into, to become one-party states is very important. But again, that's all about making sure we never think it's inevitable. Democracy is always challenged, and everybody who's ever written a constitution has always known that. Perhaps neither is inevitable. authoritarianism
No,
or democracy?
Of course not. There's no such thing as determinism. Everything that happens tomorrow depends on what all of us do today. There is no rule that says either we will rise or we will decline. And keeping that openness to history and to the future in our heads, I think, is really important.